So we're about to move on now for another journalist presentation on the war in Yemen. And again, we are very fortunate to have with us Jeffrey Stern, who's a writer and development worker whose reporting from Afghanistan, Kashmir, and elsewhere has been published by The Atlantic, The New Republic, Slate, Foreign Policy, Esquire, Time, Newsweek / The Daily Beast. I had no idea they were now together. The Philadelphia Inquirer, Duke Magazine, and other publications. Now, some of you may be familiar with his second book, The 1517 to Paris, or The 317 to Paris. It became a major motion picture directed by Clint Eastwood and was released by Warner Brothers Entertainment. Jeffrey's development work includes launching the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women Initiative in Afghanistan and building a State Department-funded student-produced museum series with exhibitions in Kabul and Philadelphia. Originally from Philadelphia, he received his bachelor's degree from Duke University and a master's in international policy studies from Stanford University. So at this time, I'd like to welcome to the stage Jeffrey Stern.
So I figured I would talk a little bit about kind of the mechanics of how I went about doing this one story, which sort of represents how I tend to approach my stories just in general. I'm not as much of a subject matter expert on any one place, so I'm always kind of learning, and I figure maybe that'll be useful to you guys as people who might be taking something like this and giving it another life. I kind of humbly, I guess, compare myself to teachers in that I'm often trying to not necessarily convince people, but to open people's minds a little bit. I think most of us are. We're trying to go to places that don't get a lot of exposure and bring them to people, often people in the West who wouldn't otherwise know what was going on. To me, there's kind of two aspects of that, and one is that you kind of have to meet people where they are. So one aspect, of course, is bringing to life something that's in a far and exotic part of the world that we don't feel like we have a lot in common with. But another is trying to find a way to reach readers wherever they are and to bring them with you, to sort of bring them on the journey. In the case of Yemen, I learned about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen very late, probably later than many of you, and I was sort of thinking, why someone like me who prides myself on being, reading the news, why was it that this took so long to kind of register with me? And I came up with a few theories, and I don't know that these are true, but these are things that have been sort of illustrative for me over my career, I guess, which is, so one, first of all, obviously, Yemen is very far away. It's, I think, even by the standards of the Middle East, to us, it's fairly exotic. I couldn't name a Yemeni person I knew. I couldn't name a Yemeni food. Plus, it was under blockade. So the most obvious reason was it was literally remote, and I think that's one of the reasons why it felt remote. This is not Yemen. This is Philadelphia. I put this here to remind myself because another reason I think that Yemen was so hard to. I'm from Philadelphia, by the way, which is why I chose this stadium. One of the reasons I think a crisis like Yemen is so difficult for us to connect with is not in spite of the fact that it was such a big crisis, but I think actually because of it. So in other words, if I told you that a friend of mine was attacked outside, you would probably be really moved by that and be worried. And if I told you that 20 million people were on the brink of starvation, that's a hard thing to visualize. I mean, what does that look like? And the way my sort of mnemonic for that is how many stadiums full of people is 20 million people. So in the case of Yemen, there was that many people that were in acute need of food aid. There was more than 1 million suspected cases of cholera. And again, I think that one of the reasons why that information just wasn't really landing with people was because it's actually too big. So one of the things that I set out to do was try to to shrink it a little bit, to try to render this crisis on a much more human, on a smaller scale, actually. This is Sanaa. This is what was once the capital of Yemen, and these are a few pictures I took shortly upon reaching there, and you can tell that. So this was a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Sanaa is a beautiful, beautiful city. It was, but the mode of building is this very light brick, and it's just basically it's no match for the kind of bombs we're dropping on it. Okay, so this is not Yemen. This was to remind me of my second theory for why people were not really paying attention that much to Yemen. And one is that it felt not only remote to us, but it didn't really feel like we had anything to do with it. This is actually northern Iraq. This was an earlier story. And this was a different story I was trying to get people to pay a little bit of attention to about the Mosul offensive a few years ago when the United States and a bunch of our allies tried to take on ISIS, and it was maybe going to be the decisive battle against ISIS. And again, it felt like people weren't paying much attention. This guy had a kind of compelling story because he had a bulletproof BMW. And you might not know about Kurdistan, and your students might not really care about, Arab-speaking Kurds and Kurd-speaking Arabs, but they probably know what a BMW is. So that was sort of my way of bringing people, almost literally, to this story, through the story of this very materialistic thing. And so I was sort of racking my brain for what can be the thing that can bring people to Yemen, can bring especially Americans to Yemen. By the time I started looking at this, we knew that a lot of the strikes were using American ordnance. We didn't always have conclusive proof at each strike. So what I did at the very beginning was I actually made a spreadsheet that listed the strikes that had happened thus far where we actually had conclusive proof that American ordnance had been used. So then I felt I could bring readers kind of on a journey with me from America to Yemen through the vehicle, almost literally again, of this hardware, this bomb. And the particular bomb that was used in the strike that I ended up focusing on, the guidance system is made in Tucson, Arizona. This is lovely Tucson, Arizona. This is someone making a seeker head, which will lock onto a laser signature reflecting off rock. These are the guidance kits getting ready to be shipped out. Each one of these is a tail section and a tail section and what they call canards. So these parts on the front will bang from side to side to steer the weapon in the air, and the tail section obviously stabilizes it. But part of it is made in Texas. It's the downtown strip in lovely Garland, Texas, where the shells for the warhead are made. This is high ferritic iron. It's very, very, very heavy iron. This is a protective coating. McAlester, Oklahoma, home of the famous Angel's Diner, steakhouse and pub, is where the shells are filled with what's called RDX. It's a high explosive that's treated with calcium so it handles the humidity well. It's a General Dynamics run facility. It's the only place in the country where this explosive can be handled, and these shells are filled. They're stored in magazines in what are called igloos. They're sort of igloo-shaped buildings all over this campus in McAlester. They're loaded onto shipping pallets. Ignore the Sanskrit. This is actually an Indian plane, but this is an Ilyushin. It's a Russian-made cargo plane, and it's the kind the Saudis use to transport these weapons. This is an air base in southern Saudi Arabia where the bombs are unloaded. They're armed and put on planes. And then they're dropped in Yemen. So this is the site of what was going to be a water well. As I said, there was a lot of people in acute need of food in Yemen, especially in northern Yemen. It's near drought conditions. And this district, they'd pooled their resources to build a well. And on the final night of digging, they'd finally struck water, and it happened to be the day before Eid, the big holiday. They all started to gather, and the Saudis said later that they thought that the drill rig was a TEL, was a transporter erector launcher, a ballistic missile launcher. And they thought that the people gathered there were Houthi rebels. So they dropped not one, but probably 12 or 15 of those 500-pound bombs on these civilians. This was the water tanker. This is actually not my photograph. This is Bander, the shopkeeper, who ran out to help and was victimized by the second wave of attacks. Some of you may have heard of this concept of double tap attacks, where one bomb will be, the Assad regime in Syria does this a lot, where one bomb will be dropped, and when people gather to help, then there'll be another wave of attacks. And that's what happened here. So Bender was not there that night, but he went there in the morning to help. This is a girl in that district that I just, as you can tell, I sort of was taken with her, kept taking pictures of her in various. This is an angry man. By the time I got there, it was about a year after the attack. This is another man. This is a year and a half after the attack, and he's still recovering. This is a man outside on the site of where the attack happened. This is that girl again. This is a man and another man's shrapnel wounds. This girl one more time. And then I was told that it's interesting for people to see some behind-the-scenes stories of what it's like to report on the ground. So I took this picture feeling like this was one of the bomb craters, and you can see how low I am. I had this very resourceful fixer and translator who I did not realize at the time, but had been taking pictures of me the entire time. So I would be yelling questions at him, and he would be delaying answering them. I'd be getting really impatient with him, and then I found out it was because he was taking all these pictures, so I couldn't be mad at him anymore. But this is before and after. This is inside a classroom in this district where all of the men gathered and just started telling their stories, and it was a pretty emotional moment, as you can imagine. This entire district had really been devastated. They all knew that they were American bombs, but kind of welcomed me in. These are people gathered outside trying to get in and hear what's going on. This is a gat chew. One of the ways to form relationships is you chew this narcotic leaf, and then people get a little bit loose-lipped. Here's something I want you to pay attention to. This is a Yemeni trick. Notice the difference between this picture and this picture. See, I've got the sunglasses on. He's got the sunglasses on. Oh, yeah, this is So that's it. These are pictures by a really wonderful New York Times magazine, or New York Times photographer who happened to be in Sanaa at the same time, and I kind of blackmailed him into shooting this. So you can see his pictures are a little bit better than mine. But so in a nutshell, that is my story. I guess I should open up to questions now. Yes? What planes dropped the bombs? We were pretty sure they were American-made F-15s that we had sold to Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis are the ones who... So there's a coalition of Gulf countries that are engaged in this air war in Yemen, but they're sort of responsible for different sectors, and that sector is under control of the Saudis, specifically that King Khalid Air Base, which is in the southwest corner of Yemen, and so it's about 200 miles away from this site, which an F-15 can close in a couple of minutes. Do we think that there's military help from the U.S.? Yes. Yeah. So first of all, I mean, most obviously, it's not exclusively, but it's almost exclusively weapons that we've sold to them and are continuing to sell to them. And these bombs were made by us. Other countries do make a similar variant, so it's not 100% our bombs, but it's probably somewhere between 70 and 80. The F-15s obviously are ours. And I think what's often lost is that we also have to train them in order to maintain those planes. They're very expensive to maintain. We have to continue to sell them replacement parts. So they would not be able to fly if we just stopped supporting them. We've been involved to varying degrees in helping them with the targeting. late in the Obama administration, early in the air war in Yemen, the State Department dispatched people to Riyadh, where they were running the targeting, and tried to help them actually learn some of the lessons that we learned in Afghanistan about how to try to avoid civilian casualties, and ended up, during the Obama administration, ended up recalling those people because it wasn't having an effect. It wasn't having an appreciable effect, and the Obama administration was worried that we would be seen as complicit, seen as more complicit, I guess. Yeah, one of the things, in an early draft of the story, we ended up cutting this because it felt a little bit cheap, but to that point, we began selling arms, we accelerated selling arms to the Gulf region for this campaign right around the time when it looked like we might have a chance of signing this Iran deal. And the Gulf states were upset that we were moving close to Iran, that we were giving sanctions relief to Iran, and part of the way to appease the Gulf states was these massive arms sales and helping them with this campaign. Obama announced that at Camp David. He summoned leaders from the Gulf countries for a summit at Camp David, and he announced it, and he opened his remarks by saying, "I want to offer my condolences to." There had been an Amtrak crash outside of Philadelphia, and a few people had died. But we were telling the story about hundreds of people dying in just one village, let alone the millions of people that are dying. And we were trying to illustrate the disparity between how we view human lives here and there. It was a little bit cheap, so we removed it. But I think your point stands. We tend not to care as much about people who don't look like us, I think. And I think, one of the things, most stories that I cover, when people say, well, what should we do? And I say, well, it's complicated. If you do this, then this thing can happen. If you do that, then this thing can happen. This is one of the few that I've covered where it actually feels very simple, that you just stop selling weapons to the Gulf states. And there's rational arguments against that, but I feel confident that they're all wrong. But I think you're right, and I think that's the thing that we as journalists are up against. What we're trying to address, but also that we're up against, because it's hard to make people read about people they don't feel connected to or outraged by.
Jeff, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the mechanics of the story. As a fellow journalist, I'd be curious to know, since you'd never been to Yemen, you said, how did you get there? How did you know how to move around? How did you get to the village? What was it like? Was it dangerous? Were there people trying to stop you? Tell us a little more about that.
How much time do I have to?
We can go to 3:30. Mm-hmm. So you can keep going.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'd never been to Yemen. I didn't know anyone who was Yemeni, and I actually realized I didn't know anyone who had ever been to Yemen. So what I did is one of the first things I did is I wrote to a friend of mine I'd met while covering. This is, I guess, a journalist thing. Wrote to a friend I'd met while covering the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, who worked for the World Health Organization. And I said, I don't know if you're probably not covering Yemen. I don't even know if you work at the WHO anymore, but would you happen to know someone who has any visibility of what's going on in Yemen? And he wrote back and he said, oh, I'm still there. I don't work in Yemen, but here's my colleague. I spoke to her a few times. She ended up connecting me to a photographer who had recently done the trip from the south of Yemen up into the north. And I talked to her a few times, and she eventually connected me to a fixer in the south and a fixer in the north. So Yemen now is basically two countries. And those Sanaa, where I showed you that beautiful city that's kind of been destroyed, used to be the capital, and there's an airport there. That airport has been shut down. So there's maybe one flight a week for humanitarian workers, but you basically can't fly in there. I tried as hard as I could to get on one of those flights, but it became clear that there was just not going to be a way. I was going to have to go by road. So I flew from, the flight was from Jordan to Aden, so from Amman to the southern port city in Yemen, where the fixer who was supposed to meet me at the airport was just nowhere to be found. And ended up stuck in the airport without my passport for a little while. It turns out he had overslept, which happens. The things that get in your way in some of these areas tend to be very mundane. I feel like the fixer oversleeping, you can attest to that. And the next day, so I had never met this guy before, but we'd been communicating virtually for a few months by then. The next day, he put me in a car with a couple friends of his, and he dressed me up in traditional Yemeni clothes and handed me a bag of cat, which is this narcotic leaf. And he said, chew as much as you can, you're going with them, and if people talk to you, don't say anything. And I said, you're not coming with me? And he said, no, I am staying here, you're going with them. So none of these guys spoke English, I don't really speak any Arabic. And there were about 40 checkpoints between the south and Sanaa in the north. It's about a 12-hour drive. And halfway through, we pulled off into a kind of hidden corner, and I switched cars to the northern team, and they took me the rest of the way. And that was, it was a pretty harrowing trip, but in some ways funny, because I could not communicate with these guys I was on this very intense day-long road trip with. He just kept pointing to my mouth and going like this, put more of this cat in my mouth. I was terrified of this stuff, because the one time I chewed tobacco, I vomited immediately. So I was like, the last thing I want to do is be at a checkpoint and have someone flag down the car and have like vomit in my lap or something. So I was trying to find a way to have it in my mouth and have it bulking out my cheek so it looked like I was chewing it without actually chewing it, but I just ended up like drooling saliva all over myself. So I think I looked like some kind of medical case, and people waved me along. With one exception, there was one checkpoint where they stopped and started searching our stuff. And keep in mind, I'm with these guys. I haven't really exchanged any words at all with them. We've sang some traditional songs, and I've like clapped along with them, but we haven't said anything. I'm convinced they speak no English. Right before I left the U.S., a friend had given me a pack of beef jerky, just in case, I found myself unable to get some protein. And it was buried in my suitcase in the back, and it was pizza flavored. It was the grossest thing. It was pizza flavored beef jerky in a pizza flavored bag, a pizza slice shaped bag. I don't even know where they found this. But so at this checkpoint in the middle of Yemen, me with my headscarf and my dress and drooling green juice out of my face, the rebel leader goes back and starts rifling through my suitcase and pulls this thing out and goes, "What is this?" And the guy sitting next to me, who we've been together for 10 hours now, exchanging no words, looks at me and he goes, "Pizza?" And so I guess pizza is sort of the universal bond between. There was some interesting barriers that came up. So first of all, the Houthis, the rebel group, control the north of the country. They had granted me permission to come. They knew more or less what I was trying to cover. But another New York Times team decided the Daily team from Cairo decided to cover, and that really spooked the Houthis. And now they were really confused as to why all of a sudden there were all these New York Times people at the same time. And I think that what they worried was that one of us wasn't who we said we were. So they blocked access, and that became a thing to have to deal with. And then once I actually dealt with that and finally got to Sanaa, the city in the north, they said the people of Arhab, the people of this district that you've come to speak with, are not available anymore. And we said, well, what do you mean they're not available? We confirmed 1 million times they want to tell their story. And it became a thing where for 2 days, no one was quite sure who said what to whom, whether the fixer in the north was maybe creating a problem so that he could sort of justify his own existence a little bit more, whether another thing that was happening is that the Houthis have a kind of semi-functioning Ministry of Information. And I think they figure that if they get a journalist who actually comes to the north, then they can just direct that journalist to the most recent, most spectacular, most horrific example of, Saudi or Gulf state aggression. So they kept saying, well, you can't speak to Arhab, but we'll roll out the red carpet to Saada, which was a city where a school bus full of children had been hit, or to this place where a wedding was hit. I mean, they were sort of going down a menu of these horrific things. But I had a Pulitzer grant and magazine editors who I had sold on the idea of this very specific strike. And ultimately, the way we were able to overcome that was by was by connecting the rebels with a local human rights organization. The local human rights organization had been in contact with the people of this district and had basically cleared access. So we sort of brought these two groups together, and they, for a few days, allowed us to go to Arhab. But one of the reasons why that moment was so powerful in the classroom, with all these men coming in to tell their stories, was because I'd made this whole journey and then been told they don't want to talk to you. So this moment, all these people piled in, and it was very emotional, and everyone was, basically everyone in this room was crying, myself included. But it also, felt right. It felt like this is what I've been trying to do. This is what I'm here for. So that's a long answer to a short question. Sorry.
Can you tell us maybe one of the more memorable stories that you heard in that room?
Yeah. Let me see if I can see him. There was a guy, Fahid, who was out, the moment of the first strike, he was out in this kind of concrete shelter that is near where the drilling was. And he is, I guess what we would call, he's like your drunk uncle. He's really entertaining, and he's really colorful, but he always, even a place where everyone chews this leaf, he chews more than anybody else. So he's always the center of attention. He's a little bit irresponsible. To buy his share of the well, he had to basically steal his wife's gold and sell it. And he was there that night and was very close to where the bomb actually fell. And he was able to describe very vividly what it looked and felt like, basically. His most serious injury was that a piece of shrapnel had gone into his back and came out of his chest. So he ended up with essentially a sucking chest wound, where every time he tried to inhale, the inner pleural space fills up with air and it pushes your lung down. So almost immediately he was suffocating, but he was trying to roll out of this stone shelter, where the ground had basically been turned into literally an oven, because the ground was on fire with flaming pieces of metal. So he was trying to get out, but his arms had been broken. So he had to roll over his friends, essentially. And to make a long story a little bit slightly shorter, he ended up at the hospital. The hospital has no blood to give because there's a blockade, and blood bags, the bags that you would donate blood into, is being held up by the American-backed blockade, the American-backed Saudi blockade. So even people who want to donate blood can't. And the little blood they have, they can't test. They don't have the viral markers. So they make people sign releases that say, we might be giving you hepatitis, but you need blood. What he needed a device called a chest seal that kind of creates this elaborate two-way valve that allows his lung to inflate while taking the air out of his chest so that he can begin to breathe again. Because by the time he got to the hospital, he was almost dead. He had almost no respiration. The doctor invented on the spot this contraption. He went into the trash and took a mineral water bottle and put a little bit of water in the water bottle, cut a hole in it, and put an IV line in the bottom of the hole, and then sewed the other IV line into his chest. And put the bottle below the bed. So essentially what it did was it created like a straw in a can of soda, where air can come out. If you think about a straw and soda, if you blow gently, air comes out as bubbles, but you can't suck air you can't suck air through a can of soda up a straw into your mouth. And you have to suck pretty hard to get liquid into your mouth. So he had essentially created this one-way valve with the help of gravity, allowed the air and liquid to escape Fahid's chest and none of it to come back in. So Fahid, basically his lung finally began to inflate, and he was in the hospital for almost a year, but he survived. The other reason that was memorable is because at the very end, and this actually is in the story, I was talking to him at the very end, And there was this very memorable moment where we were talking, and there was a sort of a whistling in the noise, and everyone got very quiet and said, "Those are F-15s." And I said, "That can't be F-15s. They're not. It's probably a commercial plane going to the airport." And they said, "No. Remember, the airport is shut down. There are no commercial planes. Those are F-15s." So it was quiet for a little bit, and then we started talking again, and Fahed said, "Touch my face," because he still has 3 or 4 pieces of shrapnel from this American bomb in his jaw and in his and under his eye. And it still causes him a lot of pain. He's convinced that it's changed his mood, that somehow the metal changes the electrical current or something. But, you know, I had this moment where I was literally touching this piece of this bomb in this guy's face. And it, you know, it was the end of its journey from Tucson to McAllister to Texas, to the face of this person who miraculously survived but kind of wishes he didn't. Do you know anyone who would want to publish them? Some of them are in the story. A lot of this extra stuff obviously is not, but maybe. I hope so.
We have time for a few more questions. Other questions? Yes.
How were you received by the general population? You're not Arab, I assume. You're not Muslim. What can you tell us about Arab culture and its treatment of visitors and foreigners and people going over there? Did they like that? Did they feel that was important?
I think I can only answer that really anecdotally, not only because I obviously only have my own experience, but because I was only there for not quite a month. But my experience, I mean, especially if to kind of preface this with the fact that everybody knew that I was American, and everybody knew that the bombs that were being dropped were American. And still, I did not. The thing I felt the most at risk of the 4 are there English teachers in the thing from which I felt the most at risk was like a U.S.-backed airstrike. Not that I just accidentally being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then the inconvenience of maybe getting, you know, someone at a checkpoint being on a power trip. I really never felt at risk. I never really felt threatened, again, even though people knew what I was representing. One of the things I was really impressed, and I don't mean this to, I guess it sounds condescending, but I think we in America have a hard time distinguishing a government of another country from its people. And even in this place, Arhab, which is very provincial. I mean, their life revolves around growing gat, selling gat, chewing gat, and growing more gat. They were still this very sophisticated understanding of, you know, you are not your government, you are not the Saudi government. We wish your government didn't sell bombs to the Saudi government, but you don't even have, your government doesn't even have total control of that. So there's a very sophisticated ability to separate these different aspects of society in a way that I don't think we have. And the only exception to that is that I sometimes felt like, and I acknowledge this might be my own projection, but with the younger kids, the way that they would sometimes look at me, I would sometimes feel like this is where the risk to us is. You know, is the kids who are 6 and 7 and are seeing their families decimated by weapons that America is supplying. You know, what are they going to grow up to think? But that may well just have been because here's this sort of stranger and his curiosity. And the one thing that I felt like is, so the 2 other kind of minor exceptions to that. At one point, I grew out a very big beard, even longer than this, and you know, with the stereotype that everyone in any Arab country has a big bushy beard. And of course, I got there and people were very good looking, and I had this sort of big, you know, like a Unabomber type beard. And at one of the checkpoints, someone started yelling, "Daesh, Daesh." They thought I was ISIS. So here's this Jewish kid in the middle of Yemen, and the Yemenis think that I'm ISIS. The other thing that happened that was, in retrospect, a little bit funny, although at the time was disconcerting, is the Houthi chant is borrowed from the Iranian Revolution, and they borrow it, I think, more because it's revolutionary more than what it actually says. And at one point, sitting with them at one of those gat chews, they were kind of making the point that, look, everyone's attacking us because they think we're Iranian-backed terrorists. And do we, you know, these are guys I was staying with were all old men. They had their guns in front of them because they're farmers and there's stray dogs and stuff. But they're like, look, do we look like the kind of people who could somehow like attack a Saudi outpost or something? And to kind of make a point, they did the chant, and I didn't quite realize what they were doing, and we were all being kind of friendly, so I sort of leaned forward and tried to kind of do the chant too, and the translator leans forward and kind of awkwardly goes, death to Israel, death to the Jews, death to all Americans. But again, that's a moment that, like in a HBO Vice documentary, the reporter would have said it was very dangerous to me. They all wanted to kill me. But in reality, it was sort of like, look how ridiculous this is. Look at us making this. I mean, it would be like me yelling. I don't know what the equivalent would be, like "Go Bears" or something. But it was like, it was this moment that was sort of endearing and funny, but required a little bit of an understanding, because it would easily be misinterpreted as, I was in the middle of a terrorist camp where everyone was screaming death to the Jews.
Did you tell them you were Jewish?
I did not.
I can understand that.
Yeah. They knew. I decided that was a little bit of a bridge too far. But I was not. I honestly, I didn't tell them more because I was there to hear their stories, and I had limited time, and I didn't really want to get into it. I did not feel at risk. If I had brought it up, they would have been, I think, really curious, and they would have wanted to talk about it. They would not have said, we're going to burn you alive or something.
Did you speak with any of the people who worked in the manufacturing plants in the U.S.? What did they say? Tell us about your reporting on the U.S. side of the story. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I did speak to some of the people who worked at Raytheon in Arizona. One of the things that I think is really pernicious about precision-guided munitions in particular is it affords people who are in support of them a lot of really compelling-sounding arguments. So, for example, you can say we should continue selling precision-guided bombs to our allies because if we don't, they'll use unguided bombs and more civilians will die. That is empirically not true, but it is rational. It makes sense. It's not a insane argument, and it's one that's especially available to people who work at Raytheon, because what they think they're doing, and certainly to some degree what they actually are doing, is allowing the warfighter to have a more precise weapon, and in theory, to reduce collateral damage, to avoid civilians. But Raytheon does a really good job of kind of insulating people, allowing them the pride and the patriotism of, we are protecting the American warfighter. We are allowing the American warfighter to stay further away from danger. But the notion of foreign sales is totally remote. It's not something, one of the guys said to me, that's a management thing. And I said, well, come on, you know that Raytheon sells a huge amount of weapons to foreign countries. And he sort of thought about it for a minute, and he said, I guess England? And then I said, we have Gulf allies we're selling this to. And he said, well, I've never seen Arabic written on a missile going out the door. On the other hand, the Raytheon, and make of this what you will, but they put a lot of effort into opportunities for wounded veterans. So at Raytheon, it's not this sort of empty thank you for your service. They really try to promote and create opportunities for wounded veterans. They're also a leader in LGBT inclusion, in green energy. They win Energy Stars from the EPA. And they put huge posters on the wall. These were described to me. I wasn't allowed in. I didn't see them. But posters on the wall of servicemen and women who are related to anyone who works at Raytheon. So you can imagine if you work in this factory, you are surrounded by the notion, and it's almost tactile, that you are protecting Americans, and you are protecting American allies. And if you think about civilians at all, you're thinking about the civilians that you're protecting, because what you make is so precise that it allows the warfighter to avoid hitting civilians. And then a final note, just that I think is worth keeping in mind, is we're at a place in time now where, a huge disruptive political force, of course, is the fact that there are very few good manufacturing jobs in this country because of automation or because of outsourcing. Arms manufacturing, I guess automation is a threat to it, but those are jobs that can never be outsourced. They're good manufacturing jobs that can never be outsourced. So there is a lot of pressure, and you can imagine how that manifests politically. There's a lot of pressure to keep those jobs.
And without getting too conspiratorial, there's a perverse incentive. Because the more stable things are over there, the weaker the demand signals, as they say, to American arms manufacturers.
Garland.
In Garland, Texas. I think that's
shells with the heavy iron.
Yeah, I think that's General Dynamics. I think.
Okay, another question.
Yeah.
I'm kind of confused. I think it used to be North and South Yemen before. Wasn't it divided into two countries before?
Yeah.
And so now it's just one Yemen. So I
And then
guess
two again.
now they're
Right.
So how do the civilians in North Yemen see it? I mean, it sounds to me like it's hard to perceive what the Saudis are trying to do otherwise just to make their lives miserable and blow up the well. I mean, how do they see this playing out and ending?
How do the civilians see it playing out?
Yeah, what are they? Yeah.
And maybe the governments too. Would that be helpful for people to get a sense of what are the goals here on the two sides, and then also how do the civilians see it?
So I think what the Saudis would say, and Sarah, please correct me here, because I'm now speaking a little bit, above my pay grade or whatever. Pay me more, Pulitzer. But I think what the Saudis would say is there is a legitimate risk to our south, which is Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen. And to be fair, the Houthis, these rebels, have managed to launch a few ballistic missiles into Saudi Arabia. They've not done a ton of damage, but I think the Saudis are not making up a threat, but grossly exaggerating a threat. I also don't know that we know, I certainly don't know, if anyone knows, Sarah would know, but it might not be that anybody knows exactly how much influence Iran actually has in Yemen. I think they probably have some. It's probably not anywhere near as much as the Saudis, or at least when this conflict started, it probably wasn't anywhere near as much as the Saudis said it was. But you see the map that Sarah showed where you've got Iran on one side and you've got Yemen on the other, why they're a little bit scared of being kind of surrounded by two potentially hostile powers. What the civilians on the ground, especially in North Yemen, see is what they perceive to be collective punishment. So you might be a civilian in Sanaa, in this city in North Yemen, and not hate Saudi, not love Iran, not love the Houthis, not really care. You might not even know what the parties are, but you feel like you're being bombed and your family is being bombed because you allow the Houthis to be there. You haven't risen up against the Houthis, and therefore you are responsible and deserving of being attacked. So in other words, I think a lot of the civilians in northern Yemen feel that they are victims of collective punishment, that the Saudi-backed coalition is deliberately starving them out, that the blockade is ostensibly to keep Iranian weapons out of Yemen, but what it's really doing, according to civilians, is purposely starving them, punishing them for the government for the rebel movement that's in place. Does that make sense, or was that? So what the Saudis and the other Gulf countries, and to a degree still the United States, say is this is counterterror. And in fact, we're still running some refueling. One of the real problems here is that the Gulf countries do something that's called dynamic targeting, where it's not like they're in a briefing and they're saying, okay, there's a terrorist target there, there's an enemy target there, go up and hit it. They go up, they refuel, and they look for targets to hit. And that's one of the reasons why they hit so many things like wells, which are emphatically not terrorist targets and really don't look that much like a missile launcher. It's not that hard to tell the difference. But we are refueling them, and the same missions that go up to refuel them are refueling counter-terror missions in Syria, in northern Iraq. So this, to us, to the American defense establishment, what's happening in Yemen is part of the same counterterrorism, counter-ISIL mission. Yeah.
Yep.
Uh-oh.
Thank you. No, I think you did a great job.
I just wanted to add another dimension that is not like very easy to know about unless you're in Saudi Arabia, which is, well, some of you might know that the architect of Saudi's involvement in Yemen was MBS, the Crown Prince. Before he was the Crown Prince, he was the defense minister, among other things. And so this is really his war. It's also Saudi Arabia's kind of first exercise in preemptive war, in this like idea of like a hot war abroad that they're directly engaged in. Saudi Arabia has been a base for U.S. Military action in Iraq and things like that in the past. This is really the first time Saudi Arabia has gone to war, and it's a narrative and a trend that MBS is really using. You see, for the first time, I have friends in Saudi who are sending me pictures of everything from, billboards to yogurt cups that have pictures of support our troops, and things like this rhetoric of patriotism and nationalism and the need to support our military is all new in Saudi Arabia, and it plays very well into distracting people from maybe the curtailing of their civil liberties, and also really just kind of augments this idea of like we need to line up behind our leader because we're a nation besieged, right? And so then the Shia threat, which I mentioned, is in many ways just a construct of the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Iran, even in its like these macro government systems, really doesn't reflect like the historic reality of these different sects. So anyway, yeah. So that's just another dimension, is that there's this nationalism, and it's something that it's feeding, or it's playing well into MBS's agenda, as well as the U.S.'s anti-Iran agenda, and as well as Israel's anti-Iran war drum, that they were playing a very lonely drum for a little while, but they've got a lot of partners now. It's like a whole bandstand. Yeah. So, yeah.
I hadn't thought of that. In a way, it's sort of like Putin in Chechnya. It's a kind of familiar playbook, right? Where you don't not necessarily creating an enemy, but grossly exaggerating an enemy, and then there's a kind of rallying behind the flag.
We have time for one more question. I did want to highlight, though, that I learned you will get my presentation, which has the photos that Jeff shared, and also anything that you've seen me post. I'm going to include links to 2 other reporting projects from Yemen that if you do want to hear from people who are on the other side of the war, who are not in the areas where the Houthis are in control, some of the other journalists have reported for the other side as well, so that you could see the comparison.
Don't read those, just read mine.
Don't read those. I just thought it was that might be an interesting, if you did have questions about the conflict, you could hear, some of those do go more into that as well. One more question or 2 more questions? Then maybe to wrap, Jeff, would you mind just for the teachers in the room, can you share very briefly just, we were talking a little bit about some of your resources that might be available to them on your reporting from Afghanistan, for some of them that might want to bring some of that into their classroom. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about your work there and what kind of resources they could find?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. So one of my big kind of passion projects is a book about a school in the slums of Kabul. It's this very inspiring kind of diamond in the rough in a neighborhood that it's called Dashti Barchi, which literally translates to the desert of Barchi. It's this sort of desert slum, but it's this ethnic minority that has somewhat miraculously created this very humanist, very human rights centered, very civic engagement minded curriculum. As the U.S. began to pull out of Afghanistan, the space for that kind of thought and thinking diminished, and they were very much at risk. So the book tracks a few members of the school community, students and teachers, over the course of 12 months as troops leave and things get more dangerous for them, but also as a way of sort of celebrating, the sort of the desire to learn against all odds. So I guess the resource is the book itself, and you don't have to read it, but you should buy a few copies. That'd be great. But if any of you, are interested in connecting students with people from that school, I could probably facilitate that. If any of you are interested in connecting with teachers from the school, even though this school it serves the poorest, literally it was a slave class of Afghanistan. Now these are the sort of first generation of graduates from the school are now reaching kind of graduate school age. They've gone to some of the best colleges in the world, literally, with scholarships to these amazing places, and they're beginning to do really inspiring, amazing things, and a lot of them are in America. So just always felt like a rich resource to connect American students with.
What's the title again?
The title is The Last 1,000.
Right, so those are a lot of resources to take away. Thank you so much, Jeff, and can we have a round of applause, please?
Thank you, guys.